Greetings, YouTube. Today I'll be reviewing the book Murder Most Foul, The Killer and the American Gothic Imagination by Karin Hulttunen. I actually hadn't pronounced that before. Hulttunen. It probably won't surprise anybody that a book called Murder Most Foul is not cheery. In fact, this book is profoundly depressing. I don't recommend, for example, reading it during the 2016 election. No, I don't recommend doing that. And I wish I had planned the book I was reading better for that particular time in our American history. This was not a good choice. However, the book is good, and I did enjoy it. And I'm going to run down from use the chapter titles as a little show notes here. We have The Murderer as a Common Sinner, The Birth of Horror, The Pornography of Violence, The Construction of Murder as Mystery, Murder in the Family Circle, Murdering Medusa, The Murderer as Mental Alien. Now, the one thing I did notice in there, or two things I think I noticed the most prevalent to me, was the author runs a little long, and her focus isn't really tight. That's my writing critique of her success with this book. The chapters could probably have been a little tighter, and I think she could have honed in on her points a little more accurately. Now, the second thing is, I began to question, as I moved through the book, why she wasn't calling out some of the profoundly, unbelievably sexist and misogynistic aspects of murder in American history, and how society handled murder and the narrative around murder in American history. Because some of the stuff in here is just awe-inspiring in its terribleness in the way it treats women. And I realized, as I got near the end of the book, I believe she didn't do that intentionally. That instead of turning this into a discussion of the feminist model of thinking, of the feminist narrative, and imposing it on this history, she let the book itself stand on its own 2 feet and just show you how sexist and misogynistic we have treated women when it comes to murder, both as victims and as accused murderers. Now, one of the things I thought the reason that I began to think that we ran a little long is the murderer as common sinner. The basic premise here is that in the 17th and 18th century, the early 18th century, pre-Civil War, I should say, the murderer wasn't seen as evil, and they weren't seen as outside the human experience, because everyone was a sinner. You were born a sinner, a toxic worldview that we could do without. But that murder is simply the final step in a long path of other sins that every human being is capable of following in. And if you violate even the smallest sin, it sets you on the path to the next larger and larger and larger, eventually leading you to murder. And some of these thinkers took it to the extreme to say that any sin was murder, because you are now on this path. You are now violating the sanctity of the compact between you and God. So when they caught a murderer, they would keep the murderer in prison, and they would counsel the murderer until the murderer achieved a sense of redemption, until the church had decided their soul had been saved. It could take as much as a year. And then they would have an execution sermon based on this, showing how this person is just like everybody else in the community. So the commonality of the murderer to the community around them was the important message. And they were a living, breathing example of that until they were executed. and they executed all of them. And they executed people as young as 12. There was a 12-year-old girl in this book that was executed for murdering a 6-year-old. Rather cleverly, she toppled a stone wall on top of the kid, on the body, to make it look like an accident. Quite clever for a 12-year-old. Didn't work, but quite clever. Now, of course, you have lots of people at the time that were probably accused of murder and found guilty of murder and confessed to murder eventually, because all of them did, and were executed that were not guilty of anything, because there's nothing as we understand as law and the legal system in the 17th and the early 18th century. It just wasn't. It didn't exist the way we think of it. Particularly when everything was so controlled by the church. It's horrible. Then we begin moving into the Gothic era, and they began to think of the compassion became a concept. And when they started thinking of people as worth saving and worthy of as individuals, the horror of murder moved out of we're all potential murderers to murderer is on the outside. They're the aberration. They are not the norm. And the birth of horror, the birth of sentimentalism, sensationalism, and literally the birth of sensationalism, of exploiting the story of the murder. They printed floor plans of houses where murders took place, showing where the weapons and the bodies and what had happened. In fact, there's a picture in here. I'm going to show it quick. Whoop, there it was. I went right past it. Here we go. This one right here. Now, this is a representation of a murder in the sense that the coffin on the top represents the wife, the 4 small copper coffins represent the children, and the body at the bottom represents the killer himself, the father and husband. And above him is depicted a hatchet and a knife, the tools he used to murder his own family, and then 2 single-shot pistols, which he used at the end to kill himself. He actually stuck 2 pistols, 1 in each ear, and pulled the trigger simultaneously. He wasn't messing around. This is a classic example of a family annihilator. But I mean, very methodical. But that image was part of the whole process of turning it into horror and presenting all the gory details. Yeah, that's not gory in our sense, but it was unusual at the time. And over time, it got more and more graphic, both in the description and in the images. They became more realistic in their images. If a woman was viewed virtuously, she was shown in a demure manner. If she had been viewed as a fallen woman, say a harlot, a prostitute, she may have been semi-nude because she wasn't worthy of being treated properly, treated with respect. So that became the norm. Then we get into chapter 5, which was the hardest to read, which was about the family murders. Not just the guy I talked about, but they went into lots of detail. In fact, the picture I just showed you had been earlier in the book when it was moving into the Gothic era, when they really got to the meat of the family murders. Most of it, which was husbands killing wives and lovers, occasionally a woman killing either a rival woman or her husband. But the worst, of course, is the children that were murdered by their parents. And the way this was used, the narrative around it was used in court, was fascinating and horrible. There's a case where a man was beating both his children, a 9-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl, with a knotted rope. He got tired of this and sent the 7-year-old girl to go get an iron set of fire tongs. So he beat his son with the iron fire tongs. And the reason he was beating his son is that his wife had run away, and he was convinced his son knew where his wife was. His wife ran away because she was tired of being beaten by a psychotic abuser. Now, the boy could not have known this information at all, or he could have been particularly brave and hiding it to protect his mother. Now, you may think that's weird, but I myself, as a child, intervened, my father beating my mother and got beat in turn. So a child can step in and do this kind of thing if they want, if they feel the need. So he took the son downstairs, leaving the girl upstairs, continued to beat him with iron fire tongs. And the girl reported hearing her brother being beaten and screaming and beaten and screaming until suddenly the beating and the screaming stopped. Now, the father's story was the son ran away and was never seen again. Yeah. Now, his defense attorney put up this defense argument that beating the child with iron fire tongs was completely justified because he had been lying. Remember, the kid could have not said anything, could not have known, so he was not lying in the classical sense, very likely. But beating a child with iron fire tongs was utterly acceptable and could not be considered a crime. But that murdering your own child was such an abomination for the mind to comprehend that no person could do that. None. No one could do that. So obviously, his client was innocent. And it worked. He walked away, case was never solved. I'm hoping the daughter was long gone by then. So you can see it was horrible. And the justice system was not just in the least. And you had this case after case after case like this in the book. Then finally we get into the case of dealing with the murderer as the mental alien. Now, the idea of this is that we got into like the early concepts of psychology essentially. And that a person who was sane could not commit murder. Only an insane person could commit murder. Only a person whose mind was alien to the norm, hence the term alien. And the people that studied this were known as alienists, which is a pretty cool term. And they got so broad as to believe that every murderer had to have been insane, even if only for 10 minutes during the commission of their crime. Of course, that's utter bullshit. There's lots of reasons that people kill each other. For money, for love, for sex, for power, because it's Tuesday, and they're not necessarily insane. Well, there are people who are insane and cannot be held responsible for their acts. But it's not all killers. And their argument was very similar to what the lawyer had said about the man that beat his son to death. The idea being that murder is such an abomination that no sane person could commit it. Even though it happens in war all the time. It happens in bar fights, and it happens in alleys, and these people are not insane. I can't believe that anyone thought that was a legitimate argument. So it's a good book. It's well written. My critique being that each chapter was a bit longer than it needs to be. It could have been tightened up, and I think she could have focused on her points a little more accurately. But I still enjoyed myself. I'm glad I read it. I just wish I had not timed it during the 2016 election cycle. That was a bad choice on James's part. Yes, it was. So, if you like the idea of true crime, and let's face it, we love true crime. There's like what, 2 channels that play nothing but true crime right now? I'm reading this in my cafeteria at work, and at night they play nothing but HLN, Headline News, and all they play all night long is true crime shows. Behind me on the screen are true crime show after true crime show after true crime show every single time I walk in the caf while I'm reading this. It was not lost on me. So if you enjoy that kind of thing, this is a book that you should want to read.